These are the ingredients for my bread. It's primarily made with Malthouse flour, and this is Dove's, but you can get Malthouse from Waitrose and Sainsbury's and all the rest of them, and probably McDougall's make a Malthouse. It's by definition a kind of flour with different grains in it, but malted grain, which means it's been left to mature in a damp, warm space so that it gets some additional sweetness to the grain and flavour. If you don't want your bread too heavy, you might want to mix it with some white flour, and I just use a standard type of white flour, any kind will do. Or if you want to get some wheat germ flavour, you might add a different brown flour, or you could put some rye flour in. So it's open to mixing with lots of different flours. I also mix it with some grains, seeds rather, because that's to the liking of the person who eats the bread, and gives it a bit of extra texture. But you can put nuts in, walnuts go well with it. Then you've got to make sure you get some yeast, and I use just powdered yeast, which you sprinkle onto your mix as you're making it, and it seems to work pretty well. And then a bit of salt. And the amount of salt you put in is pretty much to your taste, but I would put some salt in. If you don't put any salt in, the yeast goes a bit wild, because the salt inhibits the yeast to some extent, as well as giving the bread flavour. So for a sizable loaf, I'd probably put in about that much salt, which is at least a couple of teaspoons and possibly slightly more. And then you mix it all together with water and let it go through its first maturing phase. And that's what we're going to do now. So next time I meet you, it'll all be in a bowl. Some of the ingredients I've waited for this part to show you, because it's quite difficult to gauge how much yeast to put in. It probably doesn't matter greatly, but I just sprinkle it in so that it gives a sort of faint brown haze to the top of the flour. And if you read the side of the packet, it'll tell you roughly proportions to use, but I've got used to not measuring anything, so that's the way it goes. You can see the amount of flour there is quite a lot. If I put my hand next to it, you'll see the scale of things. That'll make about 1.5 to 2 small loaves, or 1 big loaf and a bit over. I'm planning to make 1.5 loaves today. And then my salt is going to be here, and for that I'm going to put that much salt in, so that's a good 2 and a bit teaspoons perhaps. And then the seedy side of it, I'll put some seeds on top. It can tolerate quite a few seeds, and I'm reaching for the bag here. And so again, some people don't want so many seeds that it's overwhelmingly seedy, but that sort of quantity will mix in quite nicely and just add that extra texture and flavour. So I've got the warm water running here. I've got my mixing bowl here. It's a metal mixing bowl, so it makes it possible to be quite vigorous. And I'm just running the water in. If you have a look into the bowl, you can see the sort of sloppiness I'm getting here. At the moment it's pretty sloppy, and I've got to mix it and see how much more water. I'm going to need a bit more water than that. I'll put a bit more in. And I'm not telling it too quickly, because I can overshoot and end up with something that looks like soup, and that's no good. It's a bit too dry still. If you wait till you've mixed it in completely and then add the water, it doesn't work terribly well. You need to put your water in whilst you've still got a floury background, because the water gets bound into the dough, and it makes the dough very solid, and you can't really mix the water in after a certain point, even if the dough's got rather dry inside. And this will produce the right texture. See, it's just sort of sticky, and I've got a little bit of dry stuff on the edges here. I know I've got that, and it helps just add that last bit of texture. Now I'm going to move the tap so you don't get that in the way, but this is where it's a bit like cake mix, and where I offend other bread makers, because they don't make bread this way. But what I'm doing with the spoon is I'm catching it underneath and I'm lifting it up, so it's a bit like what we expect to do with normal bread making, but I'm lifting it up and letting it drop down again. And all the time you can see the air is getting pumped into it by this process of lifting it up, creating a little pocket underneath the bread, and then letting it drop down on top. And I can hear the noise is changing slightly, so it's changing from a slop slop to a kind of plop plop. Can you hear the little pockets of air there? Can you hear that? There's a little fart from the bread making. There we go. And you can see already this is changing to a slightly sticky quality. Not just a wet cake mix, but a slightly sticky mix. And that's what you want. But the transformation of the gluten is a mixture of physical and enzymatic process, and it's not something that happens all at once. It doesn't have to be you bashing away at it all the time that achieves it. If you simply leave this mix now for 10 minutes and come back to it, a lot of the work will have been done for you without having to beat and beat and beat the whole time. If you want a super light bread, you've got to beat it more. But if you want just bready bread without too much bubbles in it, then the beating is not quite so critical. And when we come back to this in about 10 or 15 minutes and do it again, you'll see the texture's changed completely just by virtue of it having some time to itself. Like all good things, it needs a bit of time to itself. And then just leave it like that for a bit. None of this putting flour on top and leaving it with a cloth and all that jazz. Just leave it for a bit. And when you come back in 10 or 20 minutes and give it another bash, it'll be pretty much ready then to go in the tin, which is a very